to stand to the side of the podium because this morning Sonia Hamlin told us all to stand to the side of podiums. So, and I do what other women tell me to do. I'm Cheryl Marshall, co-chair of the conference, and on behalf of the ARCO Forum, we welcome you to our wonderful afternoon here. And before Susan Estrich introduces our esteemed panel, I would like to give sincere thanks to Barbara Roberts, who, as you know, was the governor of Oregon and, as we say, is a bi-statal forum member, Oregon and Massachusetts. And it was because of Barbara's hard work that we have this terrific panel. So I hope at the end of this, we will have the honor of hearing from Fran Rogers, who has the ballot and the answer. So don't leave until that happens. It's my pleasure to introduce Susan Estrich, the first woman in the United States to manage a political campaign, and we hope not the last.
I'd be happy to welcome the second, third, fourth, and fifth as soon as one of the men or women hire them. Anyway, it is my great pleasure to be here today with such an unbelievably distinguished panel of successful women in politics. And before we begin, I would just like to also give a special thank you to the Boston Globe for their sponsorship of this afternoon's event, and to Barbara as well. 3 cheers for the Globe. Each of the women you're going to hear from today, and you probably recognize them, has run successfully in politics in her own right and has stories to tell from the inside. My role is simply as moderator to introduce them, and then hopefully we're going to be out of here at 4 o'clock on the nose. So each panelist may take 10 or 15 minutes, whatever she feels is right, and then we'll open it up. I've got 100 questions. I'm sure you do too. Our first speaker is Kim Campbell, who in my shorthand notes I wrote down the first woman everything in Canada, which is sort of a good summary. First woman Minister of Justice and Attorney General, first woman Minister of National Defense, first woman Prime Minister, and on her way to my home state, California, my new home state, to become the Consul General in California. Kim Campbell.
Thank you very much, Susan. I'm not going to stand beside the podium. I'm a foreigner. I'm allowed to be exotic. And maybe after I have my whole body liposuction in Los Angeles, I'll stand beside the podium. The Canadian Consul General in Los Angeles has an absolutely magnificent official residence in Hancock Park, which will make me Susan Estrich's neighbor. And my friends in Vancouver are already asking me to arrange group rates on facelifts, and they're all going to recover at my place, so it's going to be an interesting time. I'm delighted to be here today to talk about something of which I am a battle-scarred veteran, and that is the relationship between the media and politics and people in public life. It's very important in looking at the relationship between the press and politics to differentiate between general problems of the press and the political process and those that relate specifically to women. I spent 1994 here at the Kennedy School. In the spring, I was a fellow at the Institute of Politics, and I came back in the fall as a fellow of the Joan Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy. And it was a wonderful opportunity to pull back and think objectively about the relationship between the media and the political process. It is a symbiotic relationship. I mean, the political process can't function without the media, and the media need the press to fill the press need the politicians to fill their columns. But it was very interesting in that period of time to be able to read some of the scholarly work that's being done on the media and their role in the political process, and to understand that there are some dynamics that take place, particularly during the coverage of elections. For example, the fact that the press tend to see election campaigns as a game as opposed to an effort to try and elucidate public policy for the benefit of voters. This leads to things like the emphasis on gaffes, the emphasis on the strategic considerations of the campaign as opposed to the actual content of what people are saying, what politicians are saying, and therefore a de-emphasis on policy. One scholar commented that, in fact, most public policy issues are over the heads of a lot of the people who are covering them. They're not experts, and I don't say that to be mean, but the fact of the matter is there are more conventional unwisdoms floating around out there about how the economy really works, and the implications of things like debts and indebtedness for the capacity to fund social programs. And so the people who are covering these issues, and very often, you know, I would be amazed, I would encounter someone who I couldn't understand why they were covering what I was doing. They happened to be loitering with intent around the city desk and got sent out. But when you don't know what you're talking about, it's often a lot easier to focus on the personalities, on the non-substantive issues of the political debate and discussion. It's also true, particularly during election campaigns, that there's a tendency to see the outcome almost largely in terms of personalities, as opposed to the underlying dynamics, such as demographic factors or even economic factors. It is less the case in Canada, but certainly more the case in the United States, that elections can largely be predicted on the state of the economy. When the economy is good, incumbents get returned. When the economy is bad, the ins are out and the outs are in. And yet sometimes when you're looking at the coverage of an election and you see people valiantly leading their parties and struggling to win public support, you would think that none of those factors existed and that the voters were totally preoccupied with determining whether they liked the way so-and-so, you know, treated his wife, or whether, you know, somebody else was winning or charismatic. And yet it underestimates, I think, the profundity of the concerns that motivate political choice. When it comes to women in the media, I think it's important to understand that they, like all politicians, function in that broad general context of a dynamic that often it seems unrelated to what they as politicians are trying to do. I think today it's true to say that blatant sexism is less common now. I think we're all pretty politically correct now, and there's certain things, although I can give you a few humorous examples where, whoa, they really said that? That's interesting. Anyway. But just as in the corporate and academic worlds, there are, in fact, quite significant cultural barriers remaining to women in the political process. And I want to just touch on a few of those to talk about how they may have an influence on the way women politicians are treated by the media. You have with you, as one of the delegates here, Judy Rosner from the University of California at Irvine, who I quote regularly in my speeches because she's done some wonderful work on women's leadership styles. I think it was 89 in the Harvard Business Review, 90 in the Harvard Business Review, Judy published an article called Ways Women Lead, and she's got a new book out called America's Competitive Secret, Utilizing Women as a Management Strategy, and we'll talk about my commission later, Judy. And I say this because it's very important, I think, for women to understand what scholars are finding out about how we, as a definable group, may or may not be different from our male colleagues. But Judy's work on women's leadership styles has shown that, generally speaking, and it's not an absolute rule, women tend to favor the interactive style of leadership as opposed to command and control. And certainly in the corporate world, that is seen to be a very valuable style of leadership for some of the new kinds of very flexible, rapidly changing corporate structures. But there are barriers to women because very often that style of leadership is not recognized by those who think they are experts in leadership as being, in fact, an effective style of leadership. And so, as Judy points out in her book, ironically, in some circumstances, men are being trained to be interactive leaders, but women are not getting ahead because they are interactive leaders. So it's okay if a guy does it, but not when women do it. Deborah Tannen's work on women's speech patterns is also very interesting. The fact that women are socialized to emphasize the rapport aspects of speech, whereas men emphasize the status aspect. And what that means is that women will often downplay their own certainty. And I don't think I'll offend the men in the room if I say that for years I used to wonder, I used to see men that I knew who didn't know their proverbial from a hole in the ground, but they were so certain and masterful. And they come in, you know, those square shoulders and the little graying at the temple, and they tell you, and you knew they were just totally out to lunch. And I think, where do they learn to do that? Who teaches them? Well, it's all part of the socialization. Interestingly, there was a recent study that I saw reported in the Globe and Mail in Canada of a study done by some Harvard scientists about trying to explain the disproportionate rate at which women scientists were leaving the profession. And they found that just as in the corporate world we're finding this, that for women scientists it was very much a reflection of the fact that although their work was superb, they didn't network in the same way. They didn't have the same political links to the power structures, and they often felt more deferential towards their bosses. There is a social context that's taking place there in which there are cultural barriers to women that we may not be aware of. And I think press coverage often reflects these barriers, that we are conditioned subliminally in our society to expect certain people to do certain jobs. if the only people we've ever seen as political leaders are men, or the only people we've ever seen as judges or doctors or corporate executives are men, then we have a certain built-in expectation of who does that job. That person looks a certain way, has a certain shape, has a certain timbre to their voice, a certain particular way of speaking and expressing themselves. And so when someone comes along who doesn't fit that subliminal model that we carry around in our mind, there's a disconnect. And that is why often women themselves are resistant to women coming into new roles, because women, we're also conditioned. And sometimes people will say, why don't women support women? Well, it's because they too are kind of uneasy. Intellectually, they say, no, there must be equality. But viscerally, they're not used to this woman, this person who is a different shape, whose voice sounds different, who expresses herself differently. That's not the model of what she thinks of as being a leader. Similarly, the whole question of interactive versus command and control. We have this conditioning. And I think we see this in the press. I think the way women are treated in the media, very often it reflects the fact that the journalist has this disconnect. I've often reflected on the fact that I probably am not typical of what some scholars would describe as female in the way I speak. I tend to be quite assertive. I was an academic, and I think the cut and thrust of academic debate tends to make you a little more assertive and aggressive. And I was sometimes accused of being arrogant. I don't think I'm arrogant, but I think, again, when you don't fit people's model of what they think a woman's going to be, they look for a way to describe you. And yet, if I were typically female, if I stood up and said, well, you might not agree with me, and, I don't want to overstate this conclusion, but perhaps people would say, get her off, where's the hook? It's very interesting to watch in American politics that I think Bill Clinton can get away with being feminine, but Hillary Clinton can't get away with being masculine. Think about that. It's also been my observation, particularly functioning at the national level in Canada, that political press corps often have a proprietary sense about the political process. And I'll bet it's the same in Washington as it is in Ottawa, where the people who've been covering national politics for a long time think they own the joint. And I happen not only to be atypical in terms of my gender, but I come from British Columbia. I actually come from the California of Canada. We're going to have a ball there. It's going to be wonderful. But sometimes British Columbians, we think we're sort of the Rodney Dangerfield of the Canadian Confederation. We don't get no respect, we very prosperous, pay all the taxes, but power is in central Canada. And so when I arrived on the national scene, there was sort of the sense among the national journalists, like, who is she? We didn't make her. She's not one of us. She didn't pay her dues. Now, I had served at local and provincial government before I went to Ottawa. When I ran for the leadership of my party and became prime minister, I was tired of being described as a rookie, and I discovered that of the 18 men who had preceded me as prime minister, I had more cabinet experience than 10 of them. But I was the rookie, I was the beginner, because I wasn't from there. And I think, again, most women who are making their way on the national scene are not from there, by definition. They haven't established themselves as being long-term tenants of that particular political mansion. And so there's very often a significant difference between the press in the national capital and the regional press. I think you probably have the Beltway syndrome. We have that in Canada as well. And so women are often treated as somehow outsiders, even usurpers. We're not the old boys. They don't know us. There are now, in my view, three main problems that women face in press coverage. And it's not, as I say, the blatant sexism that we got of old, but what I would call three: trivialization, marginalization, and ridicule. What I find very interesting is in the coverage of myself, and I still see this in things that are written about me, the effort that some journalists make to describe me as if I had never done anything. It's sort of like I sprung full blown from the head of Zeus when I ran for the leadership of my party, like, where did she come from? Because only by doing that can you trivialize the careers that people have had before they come into politics. And women, like their male counterparts, have usually done something relatively significant. I spent 3 years as the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. I was the first woman to have done so, and that was, in fact, the fundamental experience that won the loyalty of my colleagues to make me their party leader, and also made me a national figure. And yet, when I declared myself for the leadership of the party, you would have thought that I had never done anything. That very track record of legislation in the area of gun control, sexual assault, young offenders, initiatives in the area of women in the law and Aboriginal justice, all of which were extremely reflective of my philosophy as a governor were lost. And it's that tendency to trivialize that worries me a lot, this tendency to treat women as a novelty and a personality instead of giving them due accord for what they've accomplished. I had clipped out something from the paper and forgot to bring it, but just a letter to the editor from, I think it was the Globe and Mail again, which is a national newspaper in Canada, commenting on the way a particular woman had been treated in the press, that she was the Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of British Columbia. She had a PhD, and she was referred to throughout a long article as Ms. Sheehan. And the writer pointed out that on the same page there was a judge who was constantly referred to as Judge so-and-so, and someone's a Professor so-and-so, the male. But the woman was Ms. Sheehan. And again, these are small, subtle things, but they rob you of your title. You know, I am the Right Honorable Kim Campbell, and I will be that for life. Now, my sister calls me the Right Honey, but other than that, people are polite. And so you often get described, when my appointment as Consul General in Los Angeles was announced, it was very interesting that the industries who are concerned, I mean, we have major disputes with the United States over our cultural policies, because cultural policies were excluded from the free trade agreement. And the people in the industries were ecstatic. From their perspective, my appointment indicated the high priority the Government of Canada put on this area of policy. For a lot of the media, particularly the Central Canadian media, the concern was, you know, Kim Campbell goes Hollywood, is Kim Campbell going to write a splash? You know, they rob you of your seriousness, and I think that is something we have to fight against. I published a memoir in the spring of 1986, and again, it was interesting to see the differences in the reviews between the political press in Central Canada and elsewhere. I got wonderful reviews outside of the Central Canadian political press. But the Globe and Mail published an article about me, an interview, aside from the discussion of the book, where the reporter said, well, Campbell portrays herself as somewhat of an ingenue. This was a 40-odd-year-old woman coming to Ottawa as a lawyer, professor, served at 2 levels of government in Ottawa. And if a movie were to be made of her book, it should be called Gidget Goes to Ottawa. This was only exceeded by the Globe and Mail's editorial about my book, which not only misrepresented what was in the book, but got the title wrong. I thought the guy could at least have looked at the cover. You know, this would have been nice. When I was here in the fall of '94 at the Shorenstein Center, I engaged in one of the more masochistic exercises of my life. We had to write a paper, and I looked at the coverage of the 1993 election, which was the election which resulted in my being the former Prime Minister of Canada. And what I was looking at was journalistic views of the fairness of the coverage. I knew that I could not be objective, but it was a way of getting back into the election in preparation for writing my memoir. And what I found interesting was a remarkable consensus among journalists that the coverage was unfair. A lot of articles by reporters saying it was a terrible double standard in this coverage. You know, Kim Campbell said such and such, and we jumped all over her, and Jean Chrétien said the same thing, and we didn't go after him. But no effort to explain why. There are 2 journalists who tried to explain why. One, a fellow called Doug Fisher, who is himself a former member of Parliament, thought that, particularly with the CBC, that they were concerned that maybe my party would make cuts to them, and so their self-interest was to be against me. They got a big surprise because the Liberals got elected and made huge cuts. But, and one woman reporter whose view was that it was sexist. She said, tell your daughters that women only get to be in the top position when it's a hopeless case, and that the women, you know, Kim Campbell, you know, people focused on her appearance and her weight and all this sort of thing, and never made any reference to the male party leaders on those bases. But other than those 2 reporters, although there was an agreement that the coverage wasn't fair, no insight as to why. I mean, it's amusing to read somebody write, you know, gee, that Jean Chrétien sure can manipulate the media. So, like, you know, who are you? You know, where were you in all of this? You know, oh gosh, you sure surprised me. Gee. You know, well, why were you so manipulable? And I think that's the kind of issue that we need to tackle in understanding women's treatment by the press. Where do we go from here? Well, one of the things that continues to concern me is what I see as the continuing powerlessness of women journalists. More and more women are covering the political scene, but with very few exceptions, it's difficult for them to break out of the pack mentality that I think still governs political coverage. I've talked to quite a number of women journalists in Canada, and they talk about their view that women actually have a different approach to coverage, that women tend to write more contextually, whereas men tend to be more abstract. And I think the abstraction loses a lot of the nuance and the reality of what's happening in the political process. But I give you an example that even when you think you've made progress, you haven't always. The Globe and Mail, which is, again, as I say, a national newspaper in Canada, at one point the 4 chief editors of the newspaper were women. But what was interesting, after appointing women to those posts, they then created a whole new management structure above these women, of men. And the women continued to do the same jobs they had done when they were assistants, and the real serious, schmoozing, networking, political part of the job was done by the men in this new managerial structure. So sometimes when you think you've made a gain, if you look closely, you haven't. And that concerns me. And I think it's very important when we talk about supporting women in the political process, that we support women journalists and that we make it possible for them to at least speak in their own voice. It may not always be a voice that's favorable to a particular female candidate, but at least a voice where they feel they can express themselves authentically. Because there's nothing radical or subversive about the notion that the reality of life as it is lived by women, or a woman's perspective on an issue, should be expressed and given some credence to. We are not a minority. It is not, pandering to an interest group. This is, as the Chinese say, women hold up half the sky, and the women answered, yeah, but the heavier half. This is, we are part of society. We're not some bizarre offshoot of that wonderful male norm and mainstream that should be preserved at all cost. And I think the only way to change things is to be there. People have often asked me, given my own interesting political career, whether I would do it over again. And I always say yes. There's the odd moment I would compress into a nanosecond if I had the opportunity. But the only way you can make the change is to be there. Because unless you're there, the barriers will be invisible. And hearts will be broken. And opportunities won't be there because nobody actually can see and identify and name the barrier. And that's why the work of people like Judy Rosner and Deborah Tannen and others, now don't look so, you see, this is typically female. She's sitting there embarrassed.
Man would be like this.
Yes, yeah, exactly. But that is why the work of scholars like that who help us to we have a sense, we have a feeling that something isn't quite kosher here. And that these scholars can help us to put a name to it, to understand what that dynamic is enormously important. That's the only way we can begin to identify the barriers and struggle against them. I think you have to know what it is that you are seeing. When I was Minister of Justice of Canada, I brought in a number of initiatives. I had, in fact, a national symposium on women law and the administration of justice. And in the area of the law, many people feel that the concepts we deal with are sort of handed down from some Olympian height, free of any kind of bias. And it's very difficult sometimes to convince people that, on the contrary, however important certain principles are, how they are implemented in a society is very much a reflection of the specific conditions of that society at that time and in that particular place. And the ability to see what's really going on is the challenge. And that's why, as I say, being there is the only way to do that. That's the only way to provoke the responses, see them. And Mary Catherine Bateson has said that whenever women enter untraditional fields, there are a few human sacrifices before they establish their right to be there. I don't consider myself a human sacrifice at all. I loved every minute of what I did, and I'm planning to be an absolute terror as a little old lady. But I just want to close by this comment that political power is very real, and women are not going to get it without a struggle. Thank you.
You're going to love LA. Shirley Williams is another. We have such a distinguished panel today. Shirley Williams, you may recall from her role as a member of the Labor Party and a minister, as one of the founders of the SDP. She is now, her ladyship, I'm not sure of, you're a member of the House of Lords. Notice that little shake head. How does one describe a lord?
Baroness.
A baroness. A baroness. She is a member of the House of Lords who also teaches part-time and divides her time between Cambridge and London, and a great lady.
Thank you very much, Susan. I won't keep you long. It's always very tough to follow Kim because she's, not only is she brilliant, but she also uses the weapon of humour. It's one of the things that women don't know how to use. And one of the things that we need to do is to listen to someone like Kim, because it's the ability to laugh at yourself and to also laugh at those who are trying to get you down that is a huge shield and armor. And it's one that women have to learn. And they only can learn it when they've got enough confidence to show it. So we have a lot to learn from people like Kim, and Kim herself. I want to talk about two things. Three. The first I'll be very brief about. The thing that, in my view, has absolutely beset women in entering public life and political life and business leadership is something that Kim Campbell referred to, which is a besetting lack of confidence. All the way through, even now with my students, even now with my faculty colleagues, even now with my colleagues back in the British Parliament, time and again I find the same phenomenon that women say, oh, I don't think I know enough. I don't think I could say that publicly. I don't think that they would take any notice of me. And I know so many women in all these groups and many more who know so much more, who've thought so much more, who've been so much more conscientious about learning the subject they're supposed to be talking about, that my heart breaks listening to them. It is this gap between what women have potentially and their sufficient belief in themselves to actually present it, share it, and project it to other people that has been, I believe, the Achilles heel of our gender. And I say that with no particular view. I don't hold the view that women are necessarily clever than men. I do know, like Professor Rosner, that they have something different to offer. And I do know that our world is like a one-legged giant because of the lack of the strength of that second leg, what women have to bring to the solution of political and economic and social problems. So that's the first thing I want to say. And when you look at the lives of outstanding politicians who are women, you find that very, very often the key relationship has been their relationship with their father. Benazir Bhutto, Mrs. Gandhi, Mrs. Bandaranaike, the present Prime Minister of Sri Lanka. Over and over again, and also in the United States with people like Nancy Kassebaum, you found that this relationship, the trust that the fathers place in the daughters, is absolutely critical to that youngster's perception of herself. So one of the things that we have to do as women is to get across to men the importance of the role of being a father, because more and more they are tending to forget that. And it's crucial to our daughters as well as our sons that they remember again. The second thing I want to say is about being there, about what it's like, these structures that in fact make it difficult for women to have anything resembling an equal or even close to an equal share of power, the different voice being expressed, the different presentation of leadership styles and of solutions. I want now particularly to address my American friends, because I believe the United States has, in most areas outside politics, achieved remarkable levels of, if not yet equality, the approach to equality for women. American women in the professions, in business, in the economic world, are on the whole quite a long way ahead of most other parts of the world, with the dazzling exception of Scandinavia. But in politics, no. And there are two overwhelming reasons for that, and neither of them are being tackled by the American women's movement, powerful though it is. And I hope you'll forgive me for being very blunt. First, you are not tackling a funding system which makes it incredibly difficult for less well-off women to become politicians. I regard the way in which American politics is funded in the greatest democracy in the world as an utter disgrace. But one of the sidelong effects of it is that time and again it is women who ask themselves the question, can I really be so selfish with my family's money that I take a very large part of it in order to run for Congress, or even for the state legislature in New Mexico or California, and all the time the price is going up. It's almost like watching a cash machine that's gone out of control, the dollar signs rolling up before your very eyes. The second thing that I only ask you to think about, this isn't a disgrace, but it is something to think about. Why in virtually every European national parliament, including the European Parliament itself, are 25% or more of the seats now held by women, with the striking exception of my own country? And the answer is because the voting system of proportional representation elects far more women because the voters are more fair-minded than either the parties or the funders, or for that matter, district groups. Voters, if they see a list of names to fill 5 or 6 places in a big constituency, will almost always say, let's have at least one woman on that list. And so women start with, as it were, an advantage. They're going to get one of those places more and more often, too. The parties in America are slowly learning about this. They're beginning to think it's a good idea to have some women out there on the ticket. But when it actually comes to the crunch of who's chosen, isn't it amazing how often they back away from the woman candidate? I now want to speak to those of you who come from other parts of the world, because I think that we, including both American, European, Asian, all the rest of us who have the advantage of being in this hall, which means that we are advantaged women, have a very huge responsibility. And I want to finish by saying a few words about that huge responsibility to the global position of women. I was at Beijing. I was on the advisory council to the Secretary General. And one of the things that came across to me with extraordinary power at Beijing was the potential strength of the non-governmental movement. Most of them, or many of them, led by women. Incredible mobilization of power and influence and strength behind such things as laws against domestic violence, laws against rape, laws to allow women in developing countries to have their contribution economically actually taken account of, laws, if you like, to stop our gender being invisible, which in many parts of the world it still is. It doesn't exist. It's not there to be seen. These are huge goals, and they're goals to which women in Africa and Asia and Latin America are bending their efforts, but they have less power than we do. And that's why we have to put our strength behind, for example, getting our governments to ratify the Convention Against Discrimination Against Women. It isn't good news that so many of our governments in the West just haven't been bothered to get round to ratifying that convention, haven't been bothered to get round to trying to end the trade in children, which is, I think, a great slur against our achievements as a society, tantamount almost to slavery in the 19th century. So let me just say that this power of women, this unformal, unchronicled power, which is huge, immense, vast, can actually help to make our world a better place. And I'll give a last example. I've given the example of how women have come together to fight for laws to be put on domestic statute books by the power of international global pressure. But my final example is something that I at least don't often go to bed without thinking about, which is the level of conflicts in the world between ethnic groups, between nations, within nations, the structure of chaos, which is now all around the edges of our world, from Rwanda to Bosnia. Women can do much more to contribute to the resolution of those conflicts because they actually believe in conflict resolution, not in resolving conflicts by the victor against the vanquished. There are no victors in Bosnia, no victors in Rwanda, no victors in the Middle East. There can only be reconciliation. And it may strike you that when you look at the world, it is the areas where women have been most active, like South Africa, which are the most hopeful, and the areas where women aren't to be seen anywhere, like Rwanda and Bosnia, that fill the human heart with despair. So we need to fight for the voice of women.
If we don't leave this panel juiced up, I don't know what it takes. Our third speaker, where are all the men you should be talking to? Our third speaker is the woman responsible, among many other things, for putting this panel together and helping organize this women's forum. She is the director of state and local government executive programs here at the Kennedy School for the last year and a half, the first woman governor of the state of Oregon, Barbara Roberts.
How would you like to follow these two women? Well, let me begin by saying I'd like to just share a little piece of personal history to give you a sense of someone who's come from where I came to be governor. I actually began my political career as a citizen advocate, a parent seeking educational rights for my autistic son. My son had been sent home from school in the first grade, not for the day, but forever. His handicap meant that he had no right to a public school education, and I could not appeal, not to the school board, not to the courthouse, not to the state house. The law gave my son no recognition, no rights, and no recourse. And I simply could not accept that. I could not accept the unfairness, the inequity, the fact that my son's disability would be exacerbated by also being uneducated. Now, at the time, I was a divorced mother with 2 sons, no child support, and a low-paying office job. But I now had a cause. I took a day a week off work and the related pay cut, which I could ill afford, went to my state capital, and began a fight for my son's educational rights. I was politically inexperienced, I was scared to death, and I didn't have enough money to buy a cup of coffee for a legislator, hardly for myself. I simply marched up my Capitol steps in my state capital, determined to change the world for disabled children of my state. 5 months later, Oregon had the first educational rights for disabled children law in the United States of America. And I had a new direction. I began doing workshops on how citizens could advocate before the legislature. I ran for my local school board. I became active in my political party, and as they say, the rest is history. But that first political success for my son cemented my belief that if your cause is just and you are determined enough, and if you can make your case well enough, one person can make a difference in the political process. I learned it then, and I believe it still. That experience also taught me that silence is never golden on the issues of human rights, civil liberties, equity, fairness, and inclusion. For 25 years, I have been an outspoken advocate for disability rights, for women's rights, for minority rights, for reproductive freedom, for gay rights, and for non-discrimination. I comfortably describe myself as a civil libertarian, a feminist, an environmentalist, and a liberal. I have been all of those things and can still describe myself as the first woman governor of Oregon. Now, that is no small task, and it is no easy combination. But I believe strongly that if political leadership is not about risk-taking, then it is about rhetoric, and I don't think we need any more of that. For many years, I did workshops for first-time legislative candidates, and I always ended my presentation with this statement: why would you stand for election if you didn't stand for anything else? Well, I want my political leaders to believe in something besides their own re-election. I want my political leaders to have vision and creativity and compassion. I want them to have guts and stick-to-itiveness. And so from the time I entered the political fray, I felt I couldn't expect such performance of other politicians if I wasn't willing to strive to be that same kind of political leader. So I guess it's fair to say that over 25 years in politics, mine has been a career committed to rocking the boat, rattling the cage, challenging the status quo, pushing the envelope, and to coloring outside the lines. I believe in risk-taking, in reinventing. I believe in scar tissue, and I believe in the road less traveled. So let me take you back a minute to that 33-year-old parent in 1971, and if you're doing math to try to figure out, I'll be 60 in December. People, I always watch them counting on their fingers. With my first political win under my belt, and let me describe briefly how I got from there to the governor's chair, because it has been an extraordinary journey. The first thing I did was decide I'd passed this new law, so I better get on my local school board so I could make sure it worked and make sure my son got this education I'd worked for. So I ran for the school board, was elected, and served 10 years as an elected school board member. Next, I ran for the community college board because I decided that was the next step, and I served 4 years there. Then I received an appointment as a county commissioner in the most populated county in my state. It was only 1 year long, but it was the first time I ever got press, TV coverage. It was very exciting. Then I ran for the legislature and served 4 years in the Oregon House of Representatives, became the first woman House Majority Leader in my state, where I served for 2 years. In 1984, I ran for Secretary of State in my state. In my state, the Secretary of State is also the Lieutenant Governor and the Auditor, so we get a lot out of that office. We're very thrifty in Oregon. It was my first statewide election, and I won, and I became the first Democrat in 110 years to hold that office in my state. In 1988, I ran for re-election and won by winning every county in my state. So now, it's 1990, and it's quietly becoming clear, very quietly, didn't say it out loud, clear to me that I am a leader in my state. Didn't say it out loud. And I decided quietly, again, that I would like to run for governor in 1994, when my governor completed his second and final term by the Constitution. So I had 4 years to plan, 4 years to prepare, 48 months to get ready. But suddenly, that 48 months became 48 hours when my governor announced at the last minute that he would not be seeking re-election. So he dropped out and I dropped in. It seemed crazy to most people who knew me, to most people who didn't know me. The race looked absolutely unwinnable. The Republican candidate had been in the race for more than a year. He had more than $1 million in the bank. He was the most respected Republican in my state. He had been Attorney General for 12 years, a Rhodes Scholar, and a wonderful, wonderful family man. His campaign was up and running. I had $11,000 in my campaign account, no campaign staff in place, no campaign in place, and I think honestly that my husband and my father, you're right about that, my father really believed I could win. I'm not sure even my mother believed it. I at least had no primary election opposition, mostly because no Democrat thought it was winnable at such a late date with a Republican opponent so far ahead and so clearly placed to win. And as usual, like every other race I had won before, I was underestimated when I entered that tough race. No one counted on my energy, my stamina, my statewide network, my sense of humor, and my ability to come from behind. I think they also underestimated my image as honest, direct, and real. But whatever the reasons for the pessimistic predictions, I arrived on election night battered, tired, and tested, and emerged as my state's first woman governor that night. It was great. It was exciting. It was a great victory. Everybody was celebrating. However, it was tempered by three things. My father, who was one of my biggest fans and supporters through this whole process, had died 3 weeks earlier. I can't only say that. But my joy on that night was all, we're supposed to not do this, but we do this, and this is good. It once killed a presidential candidate, but women should be able to do this, and so should men. But my joy that night was also tempered by two other things, or tempered, by the passage of something called Initiative Measure 5, which was the most restrictive tax measure in Oregon's history, and the one that would be with me as I put the next 3 state budgets together. Plus, Oregon's House of Representatives went Republican that night for the first time in 25 years, and I'm a Democrat. So my win was clearly the shortest honeymoon in history, and I often describe it as I didn't even get a kiss. Yet I have come to understand that each of us plays our part against the backdrop of the time in history in which we serve, and my backdrop was a tough one. Measure 5, which was going to cost me $2.6 billion out of a $7 billion budget. Try that one on for size. A Republican House this time, and 2 years later I got the Senate Republican too. I was on a roll. I had something that some of you know, the spotted owl timber endangered species crisis. I had that little item on my backdrop as well. It was divisive. It totally polarized my state. The largest industry in my state at that time was the timber industry, and I was the first governor in history to ever be elected without their support. I had a population explosion going on in my state, 250,000 people in a state with less than 3 million people in a 4-year period. I had the same citizen frustration we were feeling nationally and across the world. It was a challenging backdrop. Many people in Oregon describe this as the toughest time to serve as governor in the state's history. Not my description, theirs. But political women like to think that we can take informed, tough, even controversial positions and positions of conscience and still stay in public office, because isn't that what the public keep telling us they want? Well, most of the women I know, not all of the women I know, work very hard at being this different kind of office holder, willing to take the tough positions, cast the tough votes, and stand for something. And we keep hoping that other women and men will begin to recognize that leadership and that courage and that strength when in fact it occurs. We would also love it if the press and the media would also recognize that kind of leadership. But I believe that there is a very real discomfort when it comes to women who are at the top in a position that is perceived to have what Kim described as real power. And from years of observing and participating in that level of government and politics, I believe the issue of discomfort comes directly from the issue of leadership. In this country, at least, women are not perceived to be leaders no matter what they accomplish or how well they do it. Our cultural yardstick for measuring leadership is clearly white and clearly male. Shortly after I was elected governor, a newspaper article in Oregon described my political career as a sudden rise to the governor's chair. Sounded what Kim told you a few minutes ago. Now, I described that 25-year career to you. Does it sound sudden to you? It felt very long and very hard. But generally speaking, a male political figure who was moved up through the ranks step by step would have been seen by as a leader long before they arrived in the governor's office. The problem is we don't look like leaders. Now, my intention is not to whine about that. It's frustrating, but I don't whine about it. But I want to help each of us, each of you, to understand the reality of that cultural measuring stick and to recognize that as non-traditional leaders, as path breakers, if you will, women must continue to lead effectively with or without the recognition. For part of what we are doing at this point in history is carrying water for generations of women leaders who are going to follow us, and we can't forget that. And believe me, women leaders won't always, maybe even usually, receive full credit for their leadership. But that doesn't make the leading any less important. Now, let me give you one of those things that politicians love, which is a list of their successes, but I want to do it for a reason. At the end of my 4 years as governor, these were some of the facts about my state. I want you to just listen a minute. Oregon had the lowest unemployment in 25 years when I left office. Oregon state government had 2,700 state employees, fewer than when I took office 4 years before. Our welfare rolls were down by 19,000. My state had the highest economic investment in the state's history and the greatest economic diversity as well. Wages were up. Our SAT scores for kids graduating from high school and going on to college were the 4 highest in the nation 4 years in a row. We were #1 in that area. We were the model state for the whole nation in the reinvention of government movement. Financial World magazine rated the states in terms of management, said we were 7th best managed in the country. We'd been 37th best managed when I started. Adult recidivism in our prisons were down 35%. Oregon's health plan was in place, controversial on the East Coast, but in my state it meant 140,000 more people were covered by health care. Teen pregnancy was down, AIDS cases were down, just to name a few of what the accomplishments looked like. Now, when I announced in January of 1994 that I was not going to seek re-election because my husband had died, and I found it was impossible to be a full-time governor, a full-time candidate, and find any time to heal and to grieve. Most people in my state understood that. They understood my reasoning. They understood my needs. However, part of the press speculated that I withdrew from the race because I was so vulnerable, and this vulnerability was based on their perception that I had not led. In spite of my record, I was still not seen as a leader. As one of my male managers said, if any male governor had left office with your 4 years of records, they would have put rose petals at his feet. Well, I didn't want rose petals, really, I didn't. Well, maybe a little, but I simply wanted credit for my record and the leadership that it took to make that record happen. But as I said, at this time in history, we won't necessarily receive credit for our leadership, and that doesn't make the leading any less important. That record was important whether I received credit or not. So while women who break the mold may not be measured fairly in terms of their accomplishment or leadership, they will still make it easier for the women who follow. And that's what it's like to be a pathbreaker. So until the yardstick changes in how we measure leadership, we must not move to fit the measuring device, but rather we must change the yardstick to recognize a new kind of leadership, one that the public and the press will come to appreciate, respect, and eventually demand. And that is our role as women leaders. And that's what you've heard today, and that is your job to make certain that those demands become part of the future for women leaders in this country. Thank you.
All of you. We have microphones on both sides of the room for questions. Because these ladies are so fabulous, I'm going to ask if you can try to keep your question short so they'll have a chance to answer. And I'll ask the first question just well, let me ask one, and then you guys come to the mics, and I'll go to you. No, you don't have to go to the mic. You can yell. But let me ask everybody a question first. You guys are so terrific, the three of you, that, right? Where are all the young women? My students, many of us who are academics who deal with young women, are dealing with a generation which does not see politics as a particularly hospitable climate for humanoids of any sort, but particularly because they listen to you, or to me, or to any of us, they see it as an inhospitable climate for women in particular. Are they right? And how do we simultaneously both tell them the truth and not leave them disheartened, discouraged, and feeling like this mountain is just too high to climb? And I'll give that to anybody. Anyway.
Well, just very briefly, I was born in 1947, and both of my parents were in uniform during World War II. And so I grew up thinking that I had to find some place to serve my country, some way to do it, and thank goodness there wasn't a war. But because my mother had been in the Navy and tracked U-boats in the North Atlantic and Gulf of St. Lawrence, it was something that girls did too in my family. My mother, in fact, was the strong influence on me because she raised me to be a feminist. But I think the answer to young women is that, you don't get anything without a fight. I'm delighted that the fight that I've been able to fight has been one that's been reasonably safe compared to that. My father fought in Italy and was wounded there. I mean, all of the things that we have in terms of liberty and democracy were paid for at a huge price. And frankly, taking a little heat from those pygmies in the media is not a big deal.
Yes.
We did.
That's right. You went, and I got reelected 2 more times. You tried to run for Congress, and it didn't work. I'll talk to you later. Find out what you do right now. And to you come to General Campbell to welcome you to Southern California, because Orange County, California is part of your territory, and we take better care of our consulate than the LA government. So our protocol office that I started 12 years ago will welcome you as soon as I get back and make sure.
I arrive October 10th.
Yeah, that's just what I said not to do, but that's okay. She did it. The rest of us won't.
The question is, you brought up, Susan, about where are all the young women. The reason I'm complimenting the subject today and the planners who did it is because I've been coming to these conferences for 14 years. I was in public office for 30 years, and certainly in public office. And yet, we didn't have the climate that I feel now, and the excitement. So what are we going to do with this? The men who run for office, whether from the city level, school board, anything, all across the United States, do not have, majority do not have the background and leadership and prestige that the women the kind of women in IWS. Why don't more of you want to run? Why is it such a black hole? And what are you afraid of? Is it afraid of lack of responsibility, a fear of the unknown, or not being able to expose yourself?
Okay, let me just stop you right there. I'm going to leave that for dinner table conversation. Fair enough? Because that is not a question you can ask to these three ladies. They have been in the crucible. Thank you. Yes.
Am I on?
You're on.
Yes. I'm very proud to be an Oregonian and to see our governor, who will always be our governor to us. Barbara, you mentioned that we have to change the image of leadership and of leaders. That we have to be considered leaders. I'm a little runt, and you can see I have a hard time being considered a leader, and yet I'm trying to be in my industry. How do we change the vision? How do we change the image, particularly when the media is so responsible for creating the image?
Thank you, and it's good to see people from Oregon. I saw several of them sitting out there. Let me say, first of all, I think that's part of what the three of us are doing right now. That's part of what women who serve in office any place are doing. Women who run for office and don't win are also doing exactly the same thing. As time goes on and more women serve, the image will begin to change. It won't be easy, but I think the question that was asked first about easy, that Susan asked is, you know, something doesn't have to be easy to be important and good. I mean, in our state where people came to Oregon on the Oregon Trail, it wasn't because it was a fun trip. It was a tough trip, but it was worth it to get there. Well, this is the same kind of trip. It is difficult. We will sacrifice. We will lose some along the trail. But in order to change the system and the attitude and the image, we will make the trip. And I think that's what the three of us have done, what many people in this audience have done and should do.
Yes, absolutely. Sure.
I just want to add one sentence. I mean, I very much agree with what Kim and Barbara have said, but I also think there are ways in which we can make it a little bit less tough. You've done something in the International Women's Forum in the way of creating mentors. I think all of us who are veteran politicians have an obligation to be mentors to young women. Because it is tough at the beginning, and you do need somebody who you can hold on to and who understands. I think, secondly, that one of the great changes in my life is that when I was a girl, women were always presented as spending their time ripping out each other's eyes in the course of pursuing a man to marry. You remember people like Myrna Loy were always the nice girl who was battling with a nasty girl for the same boring young man. Nowadays, women are actually friends of one another. It's one of the biggest changes in my lifetime. And this kind of gathering wouldn't have happened in this way 30 years ago. It would have been a gathering of people leveling their eyes at one another to see, how are you dressed, and is he going to find you more attractive than me, and is my perfume as good as yours? It really isn't like that anymore. So the great strength of women working together need to gather behind these brave young women who are going to pitch into the political process to give them a sense of strength. And the last thing I want to say is we also have an obligation, and I've said this once, I'll only repeat it once, we do have an obligation to make that political process a little less awful than it is, and that's up to all of us.
Here, here. Yes.
I'm Caroline Langridge from Forum UK. I wanted to begin by congratulating the panel on an absolute stunning performance, particularly Kim Campbell. It was an absolute tour de force. And for me, it was a real pleasure to hear a Conservative, because I think you were a Conservative Prime Minister, committed to ensuring that women followed her up the trail. That's not something we have that much experience of. I'd like to go on just to ask you, do you think that the only way in which the US will get a woman president is if there are two candidates, one from each side? And by the way, I'm not suggesting quotas or positive discrimination, just that two of the best candidates could come forward and could be women, and in which case they'd cancel out the gender issue.
I think that was to you, but Barbara, as the American, you may want to jump in on this one too.
Well, it's interesting. When I came to Cambridge in '94, a lot of people, a lot of women in particular, asked me, what is it going to take to get a woman as president of the United States? There are a couple of things, you know, it's interesting, terminology means different things in different countries, and one of my good friends here once quizzed me on my views and said, you're sort of a moderate Democrat in the United States. The political terminology is very different in Canada than it is in the United States, so a conservative in Canada is actually quite a much more centrist politician than it is here, and Margaret Thatcher, for all the fact that she was not a feminist, I once described myself as a feminist, and there was sort of an audible intake of breath. People wondering whether I should do that. But I think one of the things that makes a problem in the United States is that the American president is the head of state, not just the head of government. I think in parliamentary systems, because we distinguish that there's a very different approach that we have to our political leaders, so that your personal life is not so important. There are other factors that don't become so significant. But also the American president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of the only reigning superpower. I would hope that Margaret Thatcher made it very clear that although she may not have been a feminist, but she certainly made it clear that a woman political leader can lead a country very successfully when it goes to war. And in fact, her leadership in the Falklands, I don't think anybody said, oh, you know, Margaret Thatcher, she's such a sissy, do we want her making those decisions? And in fact, one of her advisors was here in the spring of '94 when I was a fellow here, and made the point that not only was she enormously credible with the military as a political leader, but that the fact that she really did care about the men who were going out to the Falklands, and they were mostly men, was also reassuring to the forces on that level. But I think that is a psychological thing that Americans are going to have to get over. The fact that you are a superpower and the role that you play in the world is a profoundly important influence on your political culture, whether it has to do with your disputes over Canada with cultural protectionism or your view of who should play that senior role. And I do think having two candidates would help a lot. I'm not going to hold my breath for that to happen, but
I take one.
Just let me say, I think that clearly there are women qualified to be president of the United States in this country, lots and lots of them. And I would say, as having been the commander-in-chief of the National Guard in my state, one of the things I discovered that the first thing you had to teach the guys was that you don't call the governor ma'am, you call her governor. And so I think there is a very strong difficulty we have between the strength that's required to do the job and demonstrating that kind of strength, particularly for President of the United States because of the military issues, and the comfort level of finding women and men in this country who are able to accept that kind of strength, visible strength in a woman. And there's still a lot of conflict there that we haven't come to.
I'm going to ask one question to the panel because we started having, I always feel like we sometimes have our best discussions on television before the lights go on. We started having a conversation this afternoon before this panel began about the First Lady, Mrs. Clinton, who was here yesterday. And the question I posed inside, and I would like to, if I could start with Shirley with this question, the most prominent woman in American politics today is the wife of the president. And one of the issues that comes up over and over again, particularly for those of us who came of age believing that women getting ahead in politics in our linear way meant supporting Kim and supporting Shirley and supporting Barbara or Dianne Feinstein or Barbara Boxer or others running, as we say, in their own right. We have a situation now where our most prominent woman in politics, an extraordinarily talented woman who I love enormously, is there as the wife. And I would be interested, each of you, in your thoughts as to the prominence of women in that role, how we square it, if at all, with our hope for a woman as president and for women to succeed in their own right, and how we navigate these trails of, is it sexism? Is it because she wasn't elected in her own right? Are we supposed to be saying that the first spouse should be the second most powerful person? Or are we supposed to be saying that women should get the power the same way men have gotten it traditionally, by running and winning? Shirley, if I might start with you.
I was very interested in Susan's question, and I share what I suspect may also be her reservations. I think the media have increasingly become kingmakers and kingbreakers. And I think one of the things that has happened is that they increasingly present the achievement of women in terms of a very traditional achievement, to be the outstanding wife of an even more outstanding man. Now, I would be more than happy to celebrate Hillary Clinton as a great lawyer. I think she is. I think she's got a marvelous mind, and I admired it here yesterday. Disciplined, clear, rational. But as First Lady, she was not elected to anything. And that means that almost everything she does in the political process, for example, the health care reform, is undercut by the fact that people can turn around and say, who elected Mrs. Clinton? I want to therefore say that in my view it is very important indeed that women in the United States should not simply settle for the idea that the presidency is a couple in which the woman will always play the role of being one elegant step behind the man, because that isn't what this was all about. This was all about electing the best person, male or female, we could find to be president. And if Mrs. Clinton was the best person to be president, then she should be president, in my view. So I'm troubled by the First Lady syndrome, and I'm troubled that some of our daughters see themselves as a First Lady rather than as a president.
Kim?
Well, I agree, but
I knew this would at least get you
Well,
talking.
I was struck by, I think it was it Skip Gates or somebody who was writing in Vanity Fair a few months ago, last spring, about Hillary Clinton, and he made the point that when people say that she is not accountable, and it's true she's not, that the president is surrounded by all sorts of people who are not accountable, people who don't have to be, his chief of staff, for example, does not have to be confirmed by the Senate. And so that is not in and of itself the argument. I think what I'm concerned about are women who are expected to be twofers in their husbands' careers. And I see this diplomatically because I arrived in Ottawa in 1988 with a husband. I left without one. God, I'm terrible. I mislay things. I couldn't figure it out. But in our country, in fact, there is actually a resentment when the spouse of the Prime Minister, for example, plays a high-profile role that's seen as being, quote, presidential and not attractive. But I think that part of the problem is that the president is a head of state, and that gets his wife involved in a way that like the wife of the king, and it's that kind of ceremonial thing. And I think Americans are going to have to come to terms with that. But I think it's also become kind of the sop. That's what I think the danger is, and I think that's what Shirley's getting at too. That if women are going to be satisfied with that, I mean, I think for a liberated woman being wife of the president is like for an unliberated woman being Miss Congeniality at the Miss America contest. No way. It's not the same.
Yeah.
Barbara?
Well, first of all, from an historical standpoint, this is not the first controversial First Lady by any stretch of the imagination. Eleanor Roosevelt certainly had that role. Abigail Adams, lots of First Ladies were seen as inappropriately politically active. But I think the other thing that I would say is Hillary Clinton may represent a different kind of First Lady that we are going to see lots of in the future as more and more women are professionals, as they run companies, as they become attorneys and doctors and have different roles that we worked very hard for them to get. We will find more and more men in the political realm who are married to women who are professionals. And there will be a growing comfort with the fact that you have a professional wife who is a professional person rather than a professional spouse. And so I think she may be in this very awkward place as being the transitional First Lady who moves the country to a new way of seeing the role.
I had a very good solution, by the way, to this problem. I said we'd have it all figured out when we had a first man. Right? The first husband, we could see what he did. We could see if they attack him. I think we have time. I was told 4 o'clock is our one more question.
I'm Muriel Fox from New York, and I'd like to ask you 4 terrific women, since we all agree that campaign finance in this country is such a disgrace that wonderful leaders refuse to run because they don't want to spend all their time raising money. Does any of you have an idea that might be attainable for a campaign finance reform that we could all work for that might improve the system?
I do. Every one of you use the poor system that exists this election and give contributions to get women elected who are willing to go into the system and change it and are not part of the network that will not change it.
Sure.
One more, which is that I think what we have to try to do is to get enough free time offered for those who are looking for television adverts, that it becomes a real incentive for them to agree that they will not spend beyond that limit. And then I think the worst danger of all, which is that you can spend all you have on advertising your opponent out of business, which is mostly negative advertising, would be dealt with. I think for many women facing the barrage of negative advertising they now face is a huge turn-off from politics.
Kim?
Well, in Canada, we have limits on campaign spending and limits on campaign contributions, so that tends to make things more equal. We also have free time on both the public and private networks, on radio and television for all parties and candidates. But I also, whenever I'm talking to groups, people say, how can we support women in politics? I always say, write a check. Women are cheapskates, and fundraisers know that if the wife answers, they're going to get way less than if the husband answers. You know, I am not against men. I love men, and some of my best supporters are men, and I think men have made a huge contribution. And the one thing they've learned that we haven't learned is how to make the system work. You know, you want to get women elected, you got to write them a check. Don't be a cheapskate. Do it.
I feel so strongly about this issue. It strikes me as an absolute outrage in American politics, particularly as a mother of small children, that when you see the way our country underinvests in its children, and that is, in my book, a direct cost of the way we do politics and the way we finance campaigns. The tobacco companies do just fine in this system, but there is no equivalent, as well as Emily's List and others have done. You know, kids who need inoculations and medicine and a decent education in this country don't have a powerful PAC. And I think the only way it's going to change is both by electing more people with the guts to turn around and dismantle the system that produced them, which is always the problem. I don't know how many candidates I've worked for, I'm sure others have, who say, I'm going to get right into office and get to work on that campaign finance reform system. Then they get elected by that system, and they say, well, it wasn't that terrible. And now I've got my list, and now I've got my computer printout, and now I'm the one who can benefit from that system. And unless and until we start making politics a part of the life of every person, particularly every young person, growing up in this country, and an obligation of those who own the media and the airwaves to educate people about politics, then we will be left in a system in which those who have the money dominate our political system. And let's be honest, as a matter of economics, that ain't us, and it certainly isn't our children. Thank you very much. Fran has got, did I do it on the nose? You're going to stand behind or next to me?
I always stand behind. It's too late to change. Let me just say that in the summer of 1995, a group of us sat on the Cape and thought about the experience of having 600 women from all over the world come to Boston. And we thought about how we wanted people to feel when they left. And what we said basically was, there's no point in 600 women like this being together if we didn't spend the time examining the universality of the female experience, both where it came from and where it's going. And we really wanted people to leave here really feeling the power of who we are, and really the energy of what came before us and what our daughters will do after us. And I cannot thank this panel enough for I really almost, I don't even want to go on to the next thing, but I feel I must. Yesterday, it feels like it was a week ago, but I believe it was only yesterday morning, 220 of you were so kind as to fill out what we called a ballot, but honestly what it really was, I hope, was just a survey, as I said yesterday, for us to understand a little more about ourselves and who influenced us to get here today. So we asked a bunch of somewhat silly questions, but I do want to spend a few minutes telling you the answers. And I just want to remind you, there were 5 questions. We asked you to think about who is the most influential woman of the century. But then we asked it a couple of other ways, because it's an impossible question. Who contributed the most to womankind, to the advancement of women? Who contributed the most to humankind more generally? And then we were curious about personal role models. Were any of the women that we talked about people who personally influenced you in your careers and in what you did with your lives? And in your private life, who were your role models? So here are the results. And I want to thank the Deloitte people who took our ballots. We did consider a drum roll and an envelope, but we decided it was too hokey and this was a substantive thing. But I don't know if you're surprised or not, and interesting along this line of this conversation, but we gave you a choice of 25 people and an opportunity to do other. 54% of you said the most important woman of the century was Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, I do want to say that the ballots were 85% American, and there are some differences. The 23% of you said Margaret Sanger, and 6% of you said Margaret Thatcher. When we asked the question a different way, who's the woman who's contributed most to the advancement of women, Margaret Sanger was first, 38%, Eleanor Roosevelt 30%, and Betty Friedan 10%. When we broadened it and asked you about humankind,
Eleanor Roosevelt was first, again, 47%. Margaret Sanger, 16%. And Mother Teresa, 12%. Okay, role models as you were growing up. And this one surprised me a little. 36% said Eleanor Roosevelt was a personal role model, which I think, I don't want to editorialize here, but it is interesting in light of the Hillary discussion and having just read No Ordinary Time, because it is true that and we thought there would be a discussion yesterday about how can we talk about Eleanor Roosevelt. She didn't have power derived from her own position. But clearly many of the people in this room, including myself, grew up looking at her as someone who changed the world or changed society. So it's interesting. In the rest of it was very dispersed, but there was a dead heat at 9% in terms of the other answers of your personal role model between Madame Curie, which was mostly the people who were in science, obviously, Margaret Mead, also big among those of you in science, and Golda Meir. And this is an interesting one. Who do you consider a person from your private life to be a role model? 42% of us said our mothers, 14% teachers, and 11% relatives. And interestingly, when the man from Deloitte read me this first over the phone, he said to me, one person wrote in their father, "What am I doing wrong?" And I have to say, on reflection, the answer is, what did we do wrong? Because we didn't add it. And I think we know from a lot of research that fathers indeed are often the role models for successful women, and I fault us on not having that as a choice, because to write it in, it never is the same as to check a box. I guess the other thing I would say is there was not much difference. We did it by occupation. So those of you who are in science were less likely to say Eleanor, a little more likely to say Margaret Sanger, but it was very close. Regions of the world, obviously the American women said Eleanor. Other parts of the world, people were more likely to say Margaret Sanger after, I think, the discussion yesterday morning. The woman who's advanced the state of humankind the most, only the U.S. women said Eleanor. Europe, Margaret Sanger. Latin America, Caribbean, Mother Teresa. Asia, and there weren't that many people in the answering group, Madame Curie. No differences on personal role model. And region of the world in terms of personal role models. No, wait a minute, that's not the one. That's interesting. European women were more likely to say their teachers rather than their mothers were their role models. I don't know if it means anything, but it's interesting. So anyway, it was fun, and I don't know what we learned, but I think it was fun to listen to ourselves. Let me end. This is the end of the formal program, unless you consider shopping at Filene's basement the formal program. But in terms of the substantive program, this is the end of it. And Cheryl, if you'll join me here for just 1 minute. Oh, you're there, Cheryl. It was behind me. We just wanted to. Oh, wait a minute. Before this, I promised that I would do housekeeping here for a moment. I guess that's what we call it. There are raffle tickets, and there are, oh God, I forgot. There's 2 things that you have to go to the registration desk. Silent auction. Please stop at the registration desk. These are fundraising. If money does talk, as people just said, we need to raise some money. There are some things. So please stop at the registration desk sometime today and participate in some of these fundraising activities. But as I said, we just want to take a moment and just to be very broad here, to thank everybody, and I will let Cheryl take it from here.
I want to thank a lot of our members. Unfortunately, they're not here because I know that they're busy probably cleaning up after their dine-arounds or something. But I don't want to just thank our members who really work their tail off. I want to thank all of you because you have become so engaged in this conference. It's been so incredible the way you've stopped all of us and said, well, what about this and what about that? And I think one of the things we did differently from other ones is that our conference, 99% of the speakers were women. And because we wanted you to notice the power and the value of women. And many of them are members of all our different forums. I hope that you had as good a time here as we have had having you here. Don't come back for a while, though, okay? although I may be the louder and the funnier of the two of us, I just want you to know, in case you didn't, that Fran Rogers is an awesome woman. So.
Thank you. You're great. You're great.